The 1960s were basically every Midwest wrestling star at one time or another appeared in the AWA, and the champions were Gene Kiniski, the Crusher, Fritz Von Erich, Mad Dog, Dick the Bruiser, Dr. X, who was Dick Beyer, the Destroyer, everywhere else. Tag team champions Wilbur Snyder and Leo Nomalini, Hardboiled Haggerty and Gene Kiniski, and Haggerty was a huge drawing card in the Minneapolis area. The Kalmakoffs, Bruiser and Crusher, Larry Hennig and Harley Race, Dolly Sisters, Mad Dog and Butcher Vachon. In the 60s, at that point in time, what was your TV situation? Where was it done? Was the same tape showed bicycled around the territory?
It was bicycled around, you know. They would tape it. We'd shoot it live in Minneapolis.
Okay.
We were doing live a lot.
And then live to tape.
And sometimes we would, live to tape. And then the tapes, what we would do is they kept 5 interview spots, 2-minute spots. So then the following Monday, we would do all our interviews for all the different towns. So then if you're doing Denver, you're talking about Denver, what's coming up, and you know, some of the good interviews would talk about the people they knew in Denver, and what, you know how it goes. So they did all that, so to really make it feel like it was right there.
That's another thing. Most of the talent I noticed, and this was a situation that would continue, the AWA talent, the interviews were phenomenal. You know, when you've got Crusher and Mad Dog and Hennig and Race and Bruiser. And,
well, you know, they're like, good interviewers are hard to find. But the guys that can do it, they're their own personality, and they're doing it. And nothing was written, as you know. And they were phenomenal. Some of the greatest interviews that I've ever heard in my life.
Was Marty O'Neill the first announcer?
Marty O'Neill was, Marty was a real good athlete himself, played minor league baseball, and then he started doing announcing baseball games up in Fargo, North Dakota. And he used to tell the story. Patty Page came to town one night.
Yeah.
That was just Patty. And she was singing in a bar, and he got hooked up with her, and they were drinking and singing songs together. And he always would tell us about that one. But Marty was a great athlete, and he had a great presentation on TV. He wasn't big. The wrestlers stood over him, but very credible and could really sell.
He got to be pretty much of a celebrity through the 60s and 70s in the Twin Cities and that whole area as a result, as a lot of the wrestling announcers did, but he was the most identified voice. But did Al DeRusha come later?
Al DeRusha was always, he worked for the TV station in sales, and then he started working for the wrestling office, and really his job was to help coordinate all those syndicated shows.
Right.
So when we do the interviews on Monday for the different towns, they would be inserted into those tapes, and then they'd be shipped out to Denver, to Salt Lake City, to Phoenix, Vegas, Chicago, wherever they were going.
They were the first announcers, and then of course later came Ken Resnick, Lee Marshall. Am I missing anybody?
Well, Gene Okerlund. Gene came after.
Well, I had actually a whole other question about Gene. But he never did play-by-play. He was the interviewer, correct?
Gene was just the interviewer. Gene worked for the TV station. He was in sales. And Marty got...
I wonder why. He could probably sell me the glasses on my own face, right?
Yeah, I think so. He was... Lunch with Gene. Come on. Just have a few drinks. Yeah, you need to buy some spots at our show. You know, and that was...
He and Gordon Soley doing a program would have been a pairing too. Yeah.
But Gene studied a lot from Marty. When Marty got sick, Al DeRusha asked Gene. I mean, Gene had been in radio. He was partners in a radio station in South Dakota. That's how he got his start on radio. He's got a great voice. Let's try him. So they took him up north to a cabin, and they spent the whole weekend up there watching Marty O'Neill tapes and practicing doing, the intros and the interviews.
You guys always found announcers with great voices. It was like they were off the radio in the 50s. Because
my dad always wanted that professional sound. He wanted, when we grew up and when we watched on TV in the 50s, we had the Green Bay Packers was our, and George or Hal Scott or Ray Scott, that voice. And my dad loved that voice, and he wanted his wrestling to be presented by a professional. So most of the guys that did play-by-play were professional broadcasters. A lot of them had done sports, so they could really, and they sold our presentation.
And what I did not know until he passed away, and it was written about him, was that Lee Marshall did the Tony the Tiger voice for years.
He told us that when did Lee pass away?
I believe he didn't. Somebody help me? Yeah, I did just recently, not long ago.
Really? I'll be damned.
Well, I didn't mean to break anything to you.
Who else am I missing?
Well, let's see. The television show was criticized by some people in the 80s. In the 60s and 70s, it was like every other territory, and that was your wrestling. That's all you knew of wrestling. Whether it's Mobile or Minneapolis, your TV show was what you knew of professional wrestling. And there was no need to put main events on TV, no. and it's gone so far now, don't even get me started.
I know it, me neither.
But as the 80s started, that was fine in the 60s and 70s, and the personalities carried the show, and people were accustomed to seeing the big stars on TV showcase their wares, and then you're paying to see the main event. In the 80s, cable and the start of pay-per-view, closed circuit, Georgia TV coming in. Some people said you were too long going to the dance of when the ESPN tape started. You started taping in the arena instead of studio, putting competitive matches on. In hindsight, were you late getting to the party, or it was working until right when it didn't work?
Well, I don't think so. I think when McMahon came out with such a presentation, you know, even Turner's group, when they hired me to come down there, they said, what do we need to do? You know, they're trying to compete with McMahon. I said, you can't do what McMahon does. He does it better than anybody.
Yeah.
You have to find your niche and do it different. You know, but they still kept it in their little studio down there, and nationally that lost its look. You know, and I don't know if we were behind the times. We got with ESPN. You know, we had time on there to sell, and they paid us for the time. But the talent was the hardest thing to work with at that time, Jim, as you know, because they all had this vision that they were all wanted to go to the WWE because that's where it was happening. They had this big professional look with the arenas, and that's the way you had to do it. Yeah. You really didn't have to give them all that. You could still go. I mean, when I go back in the early '80s, okay, and these are kind of ratings we had. Well, the Crockett's came to watch how we were doing our TV when they really got rolling down there, and they kind of
when they bought the truck,
right?
Yeah,
we had a 24 rating with a 64 share of the audience. Nationally, the only show that beat it was 60 Minutes that had a 25 rating and a 65 share. And that wasn't only in Minneapolis, that was in Chicago and Denver and Milwaukee. And that's where we're drawing those big gates. Yeah. What hurt is when McMahon started stealing the talent and then giving them that big look. And then he'd come into your territory and he'd look more like the AWA than we did.
Well, yeah, then we can get into that. We can do it now, or we can do it later. But we're sitting here.
We're sitting here talking about this.
Cracky. That's one thing that Vern had built talent there for so long, and there were guys that were there for decades, and they had, you know, big reputations, but all of a sudden, Vince was running against you with your own guys, which he did
they were doing
a lot in a lot of places.
And you probably weren't as on the verge of it as we were. We had guys that were there a long time, the Crusher, Mad Dog. I mean, they were right. It was near the end of their career, and we had some young guys that were building, but they weren't ready to take over. And McMahon, Hogan, I mean, we were set for life with Hogan, you know, and he kind of it backfired on us a little bit because we didn't lock him
that's
up.
a hard thing when somebody, and it's in a lot of different promotional wars. It's happened when you spend time building guys and getting guys over, and then all of a sudden somebody else is running with the same guys that were just on your TV. And people at that time they didn't really know it. It's just like, oh, we're going to see the wrestling.
You know, when I was working for McMahon, I was on the plane with him one day, and Kevin Dunn, you know Kevin.
Oh yeah.
He says to me, Vince is sitting next to him, Stephanie and Triple H are over here. He says, Vince never really wanted to put you out of business. Who the fuck are you kidding? What do you mean? No, that was never his intention. He just wanted to compete. I said, okay, Kevin.
Kevin Dunn would say Vince McMahon didn't mean to stab you 27 times. It was an accident.
I said, and I said it right to him. I said, Vince, if you wanted to compete against somebody, why wouldn't you go into our market and get a different TV station and put your show up against ours?
Yeah, why does it have to be our time slot on our station?
You take our top people, then you come in and get our time slot. You looked more like the AWA than we did. I mean, I found Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty. I brought them in, so we had a young tag team. You know, and that's what was hard. Now you have to reestablish these new young talent.
Yeah.
They're not ready to carry the load, and they can't put the people's ass in the seats yet. when you lose a Hogan and you lose your announcer and you lose your tag team partner and you lose Jesse Ventura and you lose this guy and that guy. And he targeted the AWA first. That was his big. Once he got us, he thought he could get everybody else.
Let me ask you this: during
Did I get off track here?
No, well, no. But I just,
sorry.
who was Vern was probably like an Eddie Graham or a Bill Watson, and whoever his booker was, he had a thumb on it. And
He didn't have
the
a
pulse.
booker.
But I was about to say, did he have a booker or did he?
He was the guy. He made the final decision. Usually it was Bockwinkel, Heenan, Wally Carbo, Lanza eventually, and myself. And then we would kick around ideas in that, and then he would have the final say on how it went down or who went with what.
And because in those days everything wasn't written out and micromanaged, it was basically we're making these matches. Here's what we want to do in the finish, Vern. Or here we could shoot this little angle, and you verbally give it to him. He could see it, and he's okay, boom. And that's the plan that
And
you
then
laid
he'd say,
out.
okay, then here's the way we're going to go with it, and here's who's going to do it. And it was our job not just to build it. You know, a lot of guys that are in the booking build themselves.
Yeah.
We had to help develop everybody on there. That was Vern's big day. He says, you have to have people that are going to take over for this next generation. You have to have them coming up. And that's why, you know, he developed himself. We counted 144 wrestlers, and I think 140 of them made main events around the country.
Well, talk about the camps that he started doing in the
Christ.
late 60s, right? He broke in the Anderson brothers.
Gene, Ole, and Arn.
Yeah,
or not
and Lars.
Arn, Lars. And Baron von Raschke, Larry Henning. You know,
And then he really stepped it up. When Robinson came over, that's when they got together and they had Flair, Steamboat, Cosrow, right?
We had our group was right after the Olympics. But Vern had sponsored Patera, and he kind of fell on his ass over there. And then they were going to train. I had finished football in November at Wyoming, and got signed by Atlanta as a free agent, and got left school and started training. I was going to train for football camp, and my dad, so I got the guy he can train with Billy Robinson. I said, I'm not training to wrestle. I'm training. He said he's got a good workout routine. It'll really get you in shape.
Yeah.
And you might as well wrestle with him too. So, you know, just what I want to fucking do. So I get in there with Billy for 2 hours every day, and it was all on the mat. I mean, there was calisthenics and shit, but then on the mat for an hour, I'd have to wrestle with him. And at the end of it, he'd teach me 3 submission holds a week, but he'd give them all 3 in one day. So then he'd start wrestling with you after you worked on him for a while. Yeah. And then he'd wrestle and he'd leave his arm out there. And then you're thinking, okay, let's see, what is it? Oh yeah, I'm gonna grab it. And when you grab it, he'd reverse it and crank you in some other.
Because that's why he was leaving you that arm there, to lead you down the primrose path.
And you're trying to learn, okay, let's see, I grab it here and there, and as I'm grabbing it, whoop, you're back here. And I want to kill him. But I trained with him from November all the way till we went to the Olympics in the fall, in August.
Probably, I would say the AWA produced more guys in that late 60s, early 70s period than probably any other territory.
There was only really 3 guys that produced them. Eddie Graham, the Funks, Dory Sr. is the one, and Vern. Those were the 3 guys that really supplied almost every territory. There was a few that came out of Stu Hart's
Calgary.
camp, and then there was a few Fred Atkinson up in Toronto trained. Besides that, there weren't too many other that really had a lot of, success.
Right. And Vern always looked for guys that had credentials to begin with. Chris Taylor was a heavyweight wrestler. Patera was a weightlifter in the Olympics. A lot of these guys.
He liked athletes. His presentation to the sport was different than what New York, the WWF had, and what they had down in Tennessee or in Florida.
Well, we laughed about that when I talked to the Baron. Look at Baron von Raschke and look at Mad Dog Vachon, these raving, crazy maniacs, and they're both the toughest shooters, legitimate collegiate wrestlers in the locker room.
And they all were. And he liked those backgrounds because it was easier to work with guys that were athletes. Because guys that were athletes always knew there was somebody behind them that could take their place.
Yeah.
And no matter how big they got, they never really got the big heads. But you take a guy, a weightlifter, a bodybuilder, like a Ventura, who everybody had to work their ass off to make him look good in the ring. And
Jesse was not naturally smooth.
No, but he was a great talker. He could talk to people in the building. But then Vern put Adrian with him, who Fred Atkinson had trained. And Fred said, here's a guy that really fit in with your style down there. And he did. And he was fantastic. He'd carry the load in the ring. And Jesse would only come in when he was on top because he couldn't give you a good comeback. He couldn't make you look good.
Yeah, I remember
you know?
when he came down to work with Lawler, and that's basically he'd beat Lawler up for 15 minutes, and Lawler would make the comeback because that was Lawler's MO to get the heel over.
Yeah.
When he started firing the punches, Jesse kind of jumped up and turned around and did a little hokey pokey thing because he couldn't really bump or anything.
But Jesse thought he was God's gift to the wrestling world and thought he should be the world champion over Hogan.
Well, at least he got elected governor, so maybe he had the last laugh. Yeah,
That's all bullshit.
Wrestlers and politics should be easy because you just have to cut the promo.
You'd be a good one.
Thank you.
You've
if
got
nominated,
you've
I
got
will
that
not
knack.
run. If
You've got
elected,
that
I will
knack.
not serve. Let me